Hi all, Ross here, Thomas Classic and Modern. Welcome back to the channel. We are continuing with our video series of a strip and rebuild of a A+ MPI, in this case, Gearbox. Where we are at the minute is we are about to rebuild the synchro hubs, which we do in every one of our Gearbox builds with new balls and springs. We'll then be assembling the gear cluster itself, and then we'll be getting it into the gearbox and checking some clearances. Hopefully now we're well on with the rebuild side of things in the series of videos. So we'll get stuck in and we'll see how we go. First things first, let's rebuild the synchro hubs. Righto, so here we have our stripped down synchro hubs. We've already been through and checked these, made sure they're all okay. You can find the details on that in a previous video in the series. So now we're going to concentrate much more on putting things back together. So these have been stripped, checked, and the balls and springs removed, ready for replacing. We have our new synchro hub balls and springs, and we have our synchro hub ball and spring installation tool. Bought this years ago from Guessworks. Again, it's another tool that I would recommend that if you're going to do any volume of this work, you would go out and buy. I have done this previously with piston ring compressor. So this old-fashioned type of piston ring compressor is what I used to use for doing this job. It's perfectly fine. I've seen people use bits of baked bean tin with Jubilee clips on their own. There are ways and means. If you are using any of those other methods other than the tool, I would recommend that you do this assembly maybe inside sort of a Tupperware box or something, because generally the balls and springs go flying everywhere when you've missed clicking them into place. But that's not an issue for us. We are tooled up correctly to do it. So, a little bit of an explanation, first of all, as to which bit goes with which. Obviously, if you've stripped this, I would recommend that you do one at a time. But you need to pay attention to the orientation. The way I like to remember it, different people do things different ways. So, again, not saying this is the only way or the easiest way for you to understand. It's just how I work with it. So these are the centers, if you like, of the synchro hub that sits in place. Yeah. And how I like to remember it is the rings on these outer synchro hubs are offset. Yeah. So they're not in the center, they're offset. So I like to put them on the bench with that ring, be it the gear or just the blank ring, flat on the bench, and I call that the back. The centers that go in them, you can see this one has a very, very pronounced section here, if you like, and then the back, as I call it, is flat. So I remember that as flat to back. And exactly the same with the other one. It is not as much of a pronounced section on this one, but it is definitely more pronounced than the other. So again, I remember that flat to back. That is just how I remember it. So how do we go about doing it? Put that to one side, put that to one side. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is third and fourth. Third and fourth selector is the one with no teeth on the outside. First and second synchro outer hub carries the teeth for reverse. So this is third and fourth. And third and fourth inner, if you have stripped these and you've forgotten, is the one with the much more pronounced center section that sticks through. So this is the first one we're going to do. So little bit of grease on your ball bearings, pop those into the tool, just like that. Insert the springs into the hole that is in the inner section, just being careful that they don't drop out as you're moving it. And then push the inner section into the tool, lining up those springs with the balls. He says, there we go, that's better. And then you just rotate the tool fully around so that these recesses or cutouts in the inner are in line with the section that you put the ball bearing into. Another bit of alignment. There is a corresponding dead section in the outer here, which lines up with the corresponding gap in the inner there. You have to line that up. If you do not line that up, you will not be able to select gears. I know I have done that previously, very many moons ago, and hopefully I will never get caught out like it again. So line those up so the void sections are all in line. Hold the tool, flip it over, push the center down. And then you have a nice snick as it's selecting. Lovely. That is third and fourth gear all done. And as you can see, that is lined up in my orientation, flat back to back of the ring. Again, flat side back, springs in the corresponding holes. Same orientation again, little void lined up with the gap in the tool. And this is your first and second outer, reverse gear teeth on the outside. And same thing again, there's a section that is voided out on the internal. And that section lines up with that section. Flip the tool over, push it through. And then again, we have our nice snick holding gear. That is the synchro hubs fully rebuilt. Okay, so synchro hubs rebuilt. Next section now is to get this main gear cluster assembled itself. So I've just flipped this up now so that the long section is upwards in the vise, as obviously there's more to go on this end than the other end. So that's the order that we'll work in. First thing that we need to do is to check our new bolt rings for fitment on these gears. These are the two new gears in this case, second and third, all done, which you probably caught those in the previous video if you've been watching. If not, have a little look further back, and there is a video out there showing you how to remove and install these gears. So here we have our new bolt rings. Set of 4, brand new bolt rings supplied by Mini Spares. We just drop that on the gear, and you just want to make sure that you have a nice big gap between the gear and the bolt ring, just as we explained in the previous video where you were looking for wear. So that's absolutely fine on there. That's second gear. What we now need to install is our nicely rebuilt first and second gear synchro hub. And that gets installed in the same orientation as we built it. So that needs to drop just over there. Make sure that before you do this, you have fitted your bolt ring. Again, it's something that can catch people out. So we just drop that up, line it up, just rotate that slightly, and that's dropped down into its recesses in there. And if I show you from this angle, this is how the ball ring actually sits in the synchro hub itself. Do you see those little recesses that we concentrated on lining up? That is where the ears of the ball ring sit. Okay, I'll just get that out of the way a second. Next thing that you need to refit is the top hat sleeve that sits on this gear here that carries the under gear bearing for first gear. So this is the top hat section. Sometimes they slide on, other times they need a little bit of a assistance. We'll just tap that home. All the way home. There we go. We then need our first gear under gear bearing. These are the ones that I explained previously. Make sure that all of the little rollers are in place. And the first gear one is a non-split bearing. It's a solid bearing. Little bit of lube. Drop that in place. Same thing again. Just double check the fitment of your bolt ring on first gear. This is the replacement first gear that we've sourced for this one with a nice healthy gap in the bolt ring. Drop your bolt ring into place, paying attention to the chamfer recess, cone shape if you like. Make sure that's facing the cone on the gear, and then just drop your first gear into place. That is it. That's that side of that gear cluster assembled. Simple as that. I'll just flip that over, and we will do exactly the same for the other end. So this will now be third and fourth gear. Same thing to check. Check third gear bolt ring fits nicely, which it does. And again, it slots over the cone. Then we have our rebuilt third and fourth synchro hub. Same orientation. Drop it on and let it drop down naturally. That essentially is the main gear cluster assembled. Obviously, we are missing fourth gear. So as it's going to be a bit easier for me to show you it here, this is what we have left to fit, but it does not fit to this until it goes into the gearbox. But essentially, you have another bolt ring, which is your fourth gear bolt ring. You have your fourth gear. There has to be a bearing fitted on this yet, which I shall show you. And you have a very small nose bearing that sits on the end there. So essentially, that is the complete gear cluster assembled as it would be in the gearbox. So first thing we need to do before we start getting some gears in the gearbox is get one of our new RHP bearings fitted to this first motion. What I like to do is just pop it on the back of the vise, line up the bearing, and then give it a good tap home. There we go. That's the first of our bearings in situ. Pop that to one side a second. Next bearing that we need to get ready for fitting is our big bearing in the center, the double row bearing. I'll just unpackage this a second. And when you come to fit this one, you need to retain this outer circlip off the old bearing. The new bearings do not come with them. So it's very easy to get that mislaid when you're stripping. So my advice would always be, don't throw anything away until you have finished the job, just in case something like this has gone missing. But you have to retain that. So we then snap that into place, and there's a groove around the outside of the double row bearing that ring sits into. Just snap that over, and that then gives you a recess for that to sit into, which allows it not to go too far into the gearbox itself. And that's our main bearing setup for that gear cluster assembled. We can now get it in the box. So here we have our casing that we built in either the last video or the one before, I don't know. So next thing we need to do is maneuver the gear cluster in itself. Easiest way I find to do this is to hold it between your finger and your thumb, just like so. Yeah. And then guide it down and through the main bearing carrier and drop it into your synchro, should I say, into the corresponding selectors themselves. So first and second and third and fourth. Righto, so that's the main gear cluster now dropped in, and our synchro hubs are dropped into their relevant selectors. Job done. Next bit is to fit fourth gear in this end, first motion shaft, fourth gear, with that little bearing on the bulk ring. Tap that home, and then we need to put in place the big circlip that goes that end. So bearing, bulk ring, again paying attention to the orientation of the bulk ring. Just slide that in place, and then it'll be a little bit of a wiggle to line up the gears and get that bearing started in its recess, and then tap that home. There we go, that's fully home. Make sure your gear rotates okay. And now we need to fit the big circlip that goes in this end, which retains that bearing in situ. So that is this circlip here. Pop that in. Make sure it's in the recess. Put your ears at around about 6 o'clock. And then what I like to do is just go around and tap that in. Make sure it's fully home and all in the recess. Well, there we go. That is that in situ. Okay, so that's our first motion bearing in place. We're now going to fit our double row bearing in place in much the same way. This is the one with a snap ring on the outside. So again, just line that up to give it a rough start. Make sure the gears are in line. And then same thing again. Might need to change my punch. and tap that home. There we go. That's our two main bearings, so to speak, fully home. Next thing that I like to do at this point is to double check now our clearance for the main bearing carrier. So this is the first clearance to take note of on reassembly. So first thing we need to do here now is this is our main bearing retainer. We need to check the clearance between this main bearing retainer and the actual casing, and we need to now set very slight preload on that large double row bearing to hold it in place. Easiest way I find to do this is you take your main bearing retainer, your bearing's already knocked into situ, so that's all good, and hold it into the recess with even pressure. And then what you need to do is you need to take some feeler gauges and you need to measure the very small gap that will be present between the main bearing retainer and the casing itself. Sincerest apologies must go out here, as it appears that we had an issue with our microphones and lost all of the sound to this section of the video, so I'll attempt to do some voiceover instead. So what we are doing here is holding up the main bearing retainer to the casing quite firmly, and then checking the gap that is between the casing and the main bearing carrier with a set of feeler gauges. Do this in several places until you're happy that you have a decent reading. So in this instance, the clearance that we have there is 12 thou. So we actually need a small amount of preload on that bearing in the center web of the gearbox by about 1/1000th of an inch. So we are going to insert 11 thou of shims and fit that entirely into place. That should then give us the correct preload on the bearing. The next thing that we actually need to do is check the clearance at either end of the Laygear itself. So I'm just going to demonstrate how we go about putting the Laygear into position to check those clearances. And in this instance, the first thing that I do before I do those clearances is actually get the reverse idler gear into place. Here you will see me, I'm just applying a little bit of lubrication to the gear itself, and the gear fits into the casing in the orientation as it is displayed. So the gear itself has almost a arrowhead, if you like, cut into it, so sort of a chamfer, and that section of the gear itself goes into the casing and points to the front of the engine itself. So that points to the water pump end, timing gear end, whichever way you want to determine it. But that little section of the gear, that arrow, actually points to that side. So just drop the gear into place over the peg that is on the bottom bell crank lever, and then slide the reverse idler gear shaft through the casing, through the gear, until it all lines up nicely. And there is the final resting place of the reverse idler gear itself in the bottom of the gearbox, all lined up and all dropped onto the bottom bell crank lever. So now we are going to get on with getting the Laygear itself into position. Here we are inserting the two lay shaft bearings themselves into the end of the gear. I just then drop the gear on top of the main gear cluster to keep it safe out of the way, whilst we get hold of the thrust washers that go either end of that Laygear in the casing, and then we need to insert the lay shaft all the way through. So just spin the gearbox casing around, and here we have the Laygear thrusts themselves. I just like to pop a dab of grease on the back of the thrust washers themselves. Helps to keep them in place in the casing. They do have locating tags at the top that need to drop into the casing in the relevant point, and do the same for both ends. So the small lay shaft thrust and the large lay shaft thrust. Get those popped into place, and then it's a case of rotating the Laygear down over the top of its existing position in order to be able to line up the holes in the casing, in the gear, to be able to get the shaft all the way through. It's a little bit of a fiddle, and you need to get sort of something in one end and make sure you don't rotate or move the lay shaft thrust washers out of the way, and then you can feed the shaft itself through the casing right out to the other side, which is its actual location. So there we go, that's that popped into position, and now I can actually feel that there is end float in that lay shaft. So what we need to do now is measure how much we have and whether it is at an acceptable tolerance or not. The way we do that is much the same as the main bearing retainer clearance. We need to measure down between the end of that Laygear and the thrust washer itself with some feeler gauges, and then we can measure exactly what we have in terms of Laygear clearance. I like to set these at around about 4 thou. The specification is between 2 and 7. So we're just going to measure this one here, and we find that we actually have too much clearance. So we need to insert a larger thrust washer at one end to get us spot on our 4 thou Laygear thrust. And that's exactly what we came up with. We had a larger thrust washer in stock. We measured again, and we got that clearance to 4 thou, which is just where I would like it. Okay, so we are now about to get rigged up to install the Laygear into its final position. But what we have to do now is also install the center oil pickup. Here you can see me, I am just installing our selected Laygear thrusts that gave us our 4 thou clearance. You can see the Laygear is just slotted up on top of the main shaft of the gears there. And now we're going to slot in position our center oil pickup. It's a little bit difficult to explain how to do this, as it is basically a case of fishing the center oil pickup down through the small space that you have between the Laygear and the casing itself. It does become kind of self-explanatory as you watch it. You will see I hook it in slightly down to one side, which is down near the reverse idler. There's a small hole in the center web for the center oil pickup to go through. And then it's a case of rotating the gear over, the Laygear that is, over into its final position, and just moving the center oil pickup into its position as well. Probably not explaining that very well, but I'm hoping it shows in the video how we go about doing that. And then once that's in position, we can then line up the thrusts for the final time and slot through our lay shaft for the final time also. And there we go, that's the lay shaft back in, all the gears turning freely, and the center oil pickup pipe in its resting position as well. Next thing for us to do is to now fit our main bearing retainer with its required shims. But before we do that, we need to add in the small locating plate that slots into both the lay shaft and the reverse idler shaft, which locates both of those shafts and stops them being able to move in and out. And one of the main bearing retainer bolts goes right through that locating plate and then torques up into the center web of the gearbox. So the first thing we need to do is get that locating plate in position and lined up, and then we can slot the relevant shims just behind that plate, push the gears back into situ, push the shafts back into situ, which will help hold them in place, and then we can fit the main bearing retainer and get all of that torqued up. So there you'll see the shims. That is the required amount in this case. And you'll also see in the bottom corner, there's a small mark where the locating plate has previously been used on these shims. It's just a case of getting those in place with the locating plate. And here is the locating plate itself that slots into both the lay shaft and the reverse idler shaft. You can normally see a little bit of a witness mark where it's actually sat in both of those shafts, and that hole there is the hole that the bolt is used to retain it into the center web. So slot that into position first of all into both of those shafts. Then once we've done that, we just make sure that we've got the bolt hole fully lined up, and you can assist this into place by just twisting the reverse idler shaft, which, as you can see from here, has a little slot in the end. And then what we can do is slot in our shims, push the shaft back into position, and then that helps to retain those shims exactly where we need them. And now we'll locate that hole correctly, which, as you can see here, is slightly out of line. We'll just rotate the reverse idler shaft slightly with a screwdriver and get all of that lined up, and then we'll be ready for assembly. So back in now with our main bearing retainer as everything is in position, and just get the lock tabs in place with one of the bolts to start with, and that'll help hold it all in place for us. Then we can get the other two bolts started at the bottom with its corresponding lock tab and get everything torqued up. And there we go, that's those in place, and we can now torque all three of those bolts up to 18 Newton meters. So that's the main crux of the gear assemblies now all complete. The next thing that we need to do is to actually get the pinion gear fitted, which I am just doing here, and the input gear fitted on the other end of the gearbox, and fit and torque up the two large nuts that torque those up. And both of those are torqued to 207 Newton meters. You will also see here that I'm retaining the original lock tabs on both ends. I tend to do this on 99% of our builds, as it's just something I've always done. So just get the input gear on there. There's the lock tab going on, and we'll just start the nut. And then what we will do is we need to lock up the gearbox into first and fourth gear. Now, you may recall from the previous video, if you watched our stripping video, that we had to do exactly that procedure to remove those two big nuts in the first place. So this is basically the reverse of that. And there we go. That's our gearbox now all fully torqued. Both large nuts at the end of the main shaft fully torqued to 207 Newton meters. Everything checked, all looking good. and gearbox now turns over nice and freely, no drag either way, and that's exactly how it should be once everything is torqued up and set. So there we go, that is this section of the rebuild all now fully complete. I'm going to carry on now and knock over the lock tabs and fix the centre oil pickup in place. Once again, sincere apologies about the sound being lost on this. Hope this voiceover works out okay for you. Please join us on the next video where we will be getting stuck into the very final part of this build, which is fitting the diff, shimming the diff, and then sealing up the casings as needed. So thanks very much for watching. Hope to see you on the next one.